Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, February 6th, 2020. This is our day off, I guess, on a whirlwind week of political events. I don't know. I guess we had some other days off. We had impeachment trial Monday, but also Iowa caucuses Monday, and then Iowa caucuses Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, next week, whatever. Of course, yesterday, Wednesday, the vote in the Senate on the impeachment articles. Today, Thursday, a few things on the schedule. Of course, there are things happening, but no major events. National Prayer Breakfast happening this morning, and then tomorrow, another debate. National Prayer Breakfast, I don't know. Does it count as a major political event? I don't know. I guess so. It's a thing. I don't know how they get Donald Trump awake for that. I just imagine them waking him up, in the morning like, yeah, sir, it's time to get up, with tears streaming down his eyes, as he likes to say. Sir, wake up, it's time for the national, F off, leave me alone. Prayer, oh, are you kidding me? No way. Breakfast. Breakfast, eh? Little chocolate donuts. Time to go. All right, so they get him awake. He's out there treating it more or less like a campaign rally, which is the way he treats everything. Not a big deal in the same sense as, say, a vote on articles of impeachment, which took place yesterday. You all know the results. I don't know. We'll see whether Greg inspires us to do a whole lot with it or not. I imagine there are a few wrap-up pieces we'll have to look at. All the you got the results you expected with Mitt Romney splitting the baby. Of course, once he announced that he was going to be voting for, or he was going to vote guilty, I knew, right? I guess the way he phrased it, I was like, oh, I bet he's planning on voting guilty on one and not guilty on the other. A little bit of both, so as not to offend everybody, I suppose. But that, of course, just does offend everybody. I believe he voted guilty on the first article of impeachment, which was the abuse of power article, I think, and then voted not guilty on the obstruction thing. I guess he bought into the president's counsel's argument about the timing of the subpoenas, perhaps, and into the idea that they didn't subpoena Bolton. They did, but they withdrew the subpoena. They didn't fight their way through the courts. We did. We did it in 2007 through 9. And we got the results, but Republicans don't believe in precedent. I don't know. I'm not exactly certain what convinced them to do one and the other. Not on the bandwagon of everybody donate to Mitt Romney. I'm not donating to any Republicans. I don't have anything great to say about him. There are people who do. I guess we'd say thanks for that one thing. But I don't know. I'm not sure how much it's worth. The Republicans put an awful lot of emphasis on the argument that this impeachment was somehow invalid because it wasn't bipartisan. And I guess, it was bipartisan anyway because Justin Amash voted for them, but then they kicked him out of the Republican Party and said, see, therefore, no true Republicans voted for the articles to impeach the president. And likewise, they now say no true Republican voted to convict the president. No true Republican found him guilty because they're in the process now of kicking Mitt Romney out of the party as well. Of course, it's his niece, cousin, I don't know, Rona Romney McDaniel, who dropped the Romney at the insistence of Donald Trump, is the chair of the National Republican Party, and is none too happy with him. Let's see. Donald Trump Jr. spent part of the day yesterday saying, actually, he said that they should expel Romney, and I don't think he was referring. I don't know if he knows that there is such a process of expulsion from the Senate, and I don't know. I assume he is not that dumb to come up with the idea that, oh, sure, you would get the 67 votes that you needed in and couldn't put together to impeach the president, you can put them together to kick Mitt Romney out of the Senate. I think he meant expel Mitt Romney from the Republican Party, which is just as dumb but more doable, I guess. He may even leave, I guess, if the pressure is enough. I'm not certain whether he feels any compulsion to sit around and fight for the soul of the party or not. So we'll see what else they come up with by way of attacks against Romney. Let's see some other interesting developments from today. People still harping on the Iowa caucuses, and I think there's a very small percentage of the vote still outstanding. If I saw correctly, people complaining about this last percentage. How the hell is it that these guys can't get their numbers in at this point? Somebody mentioned that they may have given up on the whole app and the jammed telephone line thing and put their results in the mail and sent them to the state Democratic Party. And we have to wait for those results now to be delivered and opened at the state party headquarters, wherever they are. All right. I'm not certain whether that's really true or not, but it's a good explanation, I think. Oh, well, here comes Greg. So rather than actually sitting here and deciding what to do next, we can leave that decision open to Greg, who often arrives with a plan, even if that plan is to run around until something falls out of our pockets and then read it. So good morning, Greg. How you doing? What's your plan today?
I got to check the trunk of cars because you never know when ballots are accidentally left there, and then we have to go count them because I don't know why.
Yes, I'm sure whatever county did it is crucial, though.
Yeah, it's got to be. So here's the thing. Let me just summarize with this with Michelle Cottle, who's a New York Times editorial board person, who had an editorial or opinion piece, I should say, which basically just says, thank you, Iowa. You've definitively shown us why you shouldn't be first on the political calendar and so much more. And that about sums it up. As Iowa Democrats struggle to tally votes and claw their way out of the rubble of Monday's caucus crack-up, there continues to be angst and outrage about the damage the Hawkeye State has inflicted on the democratic process and the democratic process with a capital D as well. Terms like catastrophe, debacle, fiasco, disaster being tossed around like salad greens. But that's one way to look at the situation. Another way is that Iowa has done the Democratic Party a tremendous service. Yeah, it was a perfect storm of incompetence, and the muddled outcome failed to give any of the candidates the electoral tailwind about which they've been fantasizing, except Pete got some, and we'll talk about that regarding New Hampshire in a moment.
Okay.
But delayed and deflated though they were, the results provided more clarity than anyone is giving them credit for. One, there's no fresh burst of voter participation. At last count, turnout in Iowa was on track to hit 2016 levels, which is way away from the Obama-inspired groundswell of 2008. We got about 170,000 caucus goers, and in 2008 we had 240,000.
Okay.
Right? So this should give particular pause to anybody betting on Bernie's argument that he'll win by creating new movement fueled by people who normally don't vote. And it should also be a warning for anybody counting on anti-Trump fervor to mobilize the masses. You know, I think we talked about yesterday that there's plenty of people that said this is too complicated, I'm just staying home. I don't know if it means anything for November. But
it really might not. I mean, Iowa, for all the things we've complained about, we said it yesterday, the caucus is so horrible of an experience that it might not mean anything. When it's just show up and vote, people may come out in droves. So relieved.
You know, what it's fair to say, I think Michelle's trying to make the point here, that you can't use Iowa to justify your I didn't have any data before I just said it theory about what's going to happen in November. It's not helping.
Well, that's true. None of that will work. Yeah, I've seen some serious panic about Iowa, and it's a small place, and it doesn't mean that much, and that's why it shouldn't be first, and yada yada.
I think Inigo Montoya's right. Iowa, I do not think it means what you think it means.
Yeah, it never did. I mean, it did once, like in 1976, and then everybody just said, there you go.
I would love to see it retold. The second point, even moderate Democrats have real concerns about Joe Biden's ability to go to distance. And we can see that because when you look at what's happening in New Hampshire.
Yes. What is happening?
Well, there's two tracking polls. That are keeping track of, New Hampshire's Tuesday coming up primary. It's only in a few days. And New Hampshire polls are notoriously terrible for trying to figure outcome, but they do help with movement. So the Boston Globe Suffolk poll, and again, I'm not a big Suffolk poll fan. I think these are the guys that decided to stop polling right before the election because Romney had already won against Obama. But still, Boston Globe Suffolk right now has Sanders with a 6-point lead over Pete. Sanders is 25.6 in the average on the Real Clear Politics. And Biden's at 17.1 and Buttigieg is 15 and Warren's at 14, but that's misleading because in the Boston Globe Suffolk tracker, Buttigieg is now in second place, only 6 points out, and Biden's he's got 19 and Biden's got 12. And what they write about it is Bernie Sanders continues to lead the field with 25. Buttigieg is closing in with a 19% showing, his best yet in the poll. Again, it's a tracker every day. 3-day rolling average. Okay. Joe Biden dropped 3 points from last night to 12, and Elizabeth Warren is holding steady at 11. So Bernie and Elizabeth are holding steady. Biden's dropping. Pete's rising. That's what came out of Iowa.
All right.
And so by not having a winner, and in the end, Bernie may actually eke out a delegate SDE lead, which is the official who won. Even though they're going to be tied in the number of delegates. It's essentially a tie coming out of Iowa with 95% of the vote in. And how do you win that last 5%? Satellite caucuses that aren't in Iowa, maybe. And, those tend to be one-sided. Because, who wants to go to a satellite caucus?
Right. So whoever has the gumption to organize one wins.
And invite my friends, So, and there's democracy right there for you.
That's true. That's pretty bad.
That's just as good as pulling the name out of the hat.
Well, yes, if there's only
because
one name
it's totally representative of everybody, right? Anyway, Biden drops 3 points from last night to 12. Elizabeth Warren is holding steady at 11. And looking deeper in the crosstabs, the write-up for WBZ says in Boston, Buttigieg appears to be siphoning voters away from Biden in a couple of key areas. He's up by 4 among women, and Biden is down by 4. Similar scenario among registered Democrats, a crucial demo for Biden, because again, in New Hampshire, don't forget, Indies can vote. Sanders continues to hold steady, but is showing no signs of growth. That's the same point that Michelle Cottle was making about the Iowa caucuses and the numbers. And Biden's woes are highlighted by a startling 6-point drop among one of the core elements of his base, voters over age 65. People like a winner, and if you look like a loser, all of a sudden you smell like garlic and everybody wants to run away from you.
That's what Iowa always really was, determining who looks like a winner and who looks like a loser, and everybody decides based on that. It was a campaign hack. It always was.
Meanwhile, Warren's stretch run appeals to female voters have yet to gain traction as she continues to run third with women behind the two frontrunners.
Third with women.
Third with women, and both Pete and Bernie are beating her there. So,
women,
you have to look at the Iowa results
by themselves.
And then what this poll is telling us about New Hampshire. And undeniably, Warren's in trouble. Because if she doesn't do well in Iowa and New Hampshire, where's she going to do well?
The other states.
Which ones?
I don't know. What's next? There's
South Carolina?
58,
Nevada?
48 left. Yes. I don't know. No, Nevada's a caucus.
Tuesday?
Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, you have to hang on to wait. That's the problem with these two stupid contests. Yeah, I guess
got
so.
political trouble. It may not be mathematical trouble,
we
but
all
she's
have
got
to stand here and
trouble.
say so.
And the same is true for Biden, because don't forget, 90% of this made-up statistic, 90% of his campaign is on the electable one.
I guess.
So if you finish fourth in the first two states, how do you make the case that you're electable? And that's where everybody says, "Oh, the guy smells like garlic."
I guess so. Yeah, I mean, that's the big takeaway from Iowa and New Hampshire is supposed to be the takeaway that you would get if you didn't look under the hood. Because who's going to look under the hood? You and me, and that's it.
That's it, exactly. So, unpredictable. Again, the tracking polls don't really predict terribly well. But all I'm saying is that there is some movement for Pete. And so, arguably, he won the news cycle because he got out first and said, I won, even though the votes weren't in, and pissed off a lot of people who didn't vote for him. But it may have worked for New Hampshire.
Yeah, well, I wonder whether people should do things that work or not.
That's the George W. Bush 2000 model.
Yeah.
And
well, that guy was president, we said.
Yeah.
That's what they told me. He was the president.
That's what they taught in close race school.
Yeah.
And I remembered it.
Right.
And I went from there. So that's where the politics stand. So, right now the Democratic race is something of a muddle and nobody really quite knows what's going on. Bernie's got a terrific chance to win because he really should do well in New Hampshire. And then we'll see how he does in Nevada. He's got a good chance there. It's a caucus state. And then South Carolina. And you really can't judge South Carolina as being a firewall for anybody until you see what happens in the first three. And we'll have two of them under our belts by Wednesday.
I guess so. Well, maybe. What
assuming
if they
you
can't
have
count?
the votes, and it doesn't take until November 2023, which is when we're going to find out who really won Iowa.
There's no reason why
By
New
the time
Hampshire
we
couldn't
find
have
out
the
who
same problem.
really won Iowa, it won't matter.
Yes. Well, that's true. And it was always the case, too. If you followed Iowa over the course of a couple of election cycles, you see, I think, we mentioned this a little bit. You would announce who's the winner of Iowa, and then when convention time came, national convention time, suddenly, occasionally people would take note of the fact that, the person that won Iowa didn't actually get the most delegates in Iowa in the end, because they go through all these weird processes at the county and then the state level, and they vote and they round off and this and that. But who cares, because it's all locked up for so-and-so at this point.
Right. It gets even more complicated than just figuring out, your state delegate equivalents, because you also are rewarded for having a wide geographic spread of votes, which Pete is doing quite well with.
Oh.
And so it's a weird calculation. Nobody understands it. Publishing different numbers just makes it even more muddled, not more transparent. It's a terrible system, and they should junk it. And we said this a long time ago, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And nothing about what happened this year changes that. In fact, if anything, it accelerates the calls to do exactly that. Get rid of it.
That's the thank you, Iowa part.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's that. And then, of course, the other big story, State of the Union's over, and nobody watched it. It had terrible ratings.
That's true, and he cares about that.
Yeah. And what came out of that? Actually, people are still talking about Nancy, so congratulations.
They are.
So end of that. I mean, in weird ways, too. I mean, Matt Gaetz says that, she committed a crime because she destroyed some document, and let's sue her.
I really don't. I'd love to find out.
I'm looking at that and saying, why are you suing her? I thought
that.
Devin Nunes is the one supposed to sue everybody.
Yeah. Well, that was pretty, and he went and got by the way, his letter announcing that he was going to file an ethics charge, he had notarized as if that was a thing.
Oh, that makes it official,
not.
Right?
Yes, sure. I don't know. He spent some money in notarizing it, so it makes it look more official. And I guess if you tear up his letter, you're supposed to be in trouble now. I don't know.
Right. So Vox says 97% of the votes have been reported in the Iowa caucuses, and Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg are still in a very close race. And I describe that as doesn't matter anymore territory.
Okay. All right.
So I think that's where we're at. Now, big thing happened. Mitt Romney did something that nobody expected, and certainly the White House didn't expect. And he voted to convict Donald Trump yesterday.
One
Trump was acquitted but not exonerated, as you know. Yes. Mark Murray summed it up pretty well here. At the end of the day, the U.S. Senate didn't need to censure President Trump over the Ukraine scandal because Mitt Romney did it for the chamber on Wednesday.
That's a way of putting it.
The president asked the foreign government to investigate his political rival, said Romney, from what was really a touching speech. He actually even had trouble getting through it. Oh. If you watch him give it, it's not that long, and it's well worth watching. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values. Corrupting an election to keep oneself in office is perhaps the most abusive and destructive violation of one's oath of office that I can imagine. Now, McKay Coppins got the scoop because Romney told him that this is what was going to happen. And, of course, he was savaged by the usual people you'd expect to savage him. And the weird part about all of that is yesterday, one of the Fox and Friends hosts was saying, just how important her faith is in supporting Donald Trump, because clearly Trump is speaking through God. And then today, Brian Kilmeade saying, What's this nonsense about Romney babbling about his faith? That's so stupid and phony. Everybody understands that. And the person who had said the first comment, sitting next to him.
Yeah. Probably had nothing to say about that, I'm sure.
No, well, I don't know. I didn't watch it. I'm just looking at how it's being carried over Twitter.
Okay.
Because you'd have to watch Fox and Friends to see the whole thing and really understand the nuance. I ain't doing that.
Make it up.
Somebody else can do that.
All right.
But the hypocrisy just reeks even more than garlic.
Oh, yes, right. And that's our gold standard.
So, you had that. Nancy Letourneau has a nice piece here because there's other names that need to be mentioned as well. Profiles in Courage, Mitt Romney, and Doug Jones. And I'll just read the part to you that struck me because, I feel like this is me. Me here. We have grown used to being cynical about politicians. It's often warranted by those who seem to put their own interests above those they represent. But at least for today, in a vote that will define their professional careers, Mitt Romney and Doug Jones did the opposite. Both of them voted to convict. Mm-hmm. They voted to defend what is right and true because, as Representative Adam Schiff said, it matters. You don't need to agree with either of them on anything else to commend their courage. And it's just right. And it's just, again, it was just so odd watching the commentators yesterday, especially the Inside the Beltway DC folks, struggling, even the good commentators, with trying to explain how Romney could possibly vote this way, or even Doug Jones. Well, let's look at the vote record. Let's go back and see what the district think. What's the PVI and what's this and that. And none of these discussions had, well, it's the right thing. And they felt like they had to do the right thing. Oh, no, that can't be the reason. We have to go back and look, and this is what's going on. And Romney has this. And guys, it's just because it was the right thing. It's so foreign to the way you cover politics. You don't even know how to integrate it back into the story. And that is the story. So, to give all these other reasons, it's nice. It's good background. But don't leave out point number one. Yeah. Point number one is because it's right.
I don't know why, how, what, where, when.
Oh, no, it can't be that. No, it's got to be because, you have to realize. And then, of course, the enablers like Byron York were already up with how do you reconcile Romney's so-called, conscience vote with the opportunism that's his entire career? Really?
What? I don't know.
What? I mean, it's just it's like Brian Kilmeade in Religion and Faith. Whatever you can say about Romney, he's pretty sincere about what he believes. He tells you he's been the same person all of these years. Then you have, of course, the folks on the other side saying, you see, if you didn't savage Romney back when he was running against Obama, we wouldn't have all of this. And I'm thinking, okay, fine. I like Never Trumpers. They're really nice guys, But this is on Republicans, not Democrats. We're not the reason that we have Trump. You are. So own it and deal with it. And if you're going to try to negate Obama and pretend that didn't exist, no. We're not playing the game.
I'm with it. I'm with that. I don't know. I don't know why they can't even do it. And even for the cynical crowd, I don't understand how they can't reconcile the votes and say, for one thing, he voted guilty on one count and not guilty on the other. And he was the only one that did it, and all the attention was on him. How can I reconcile that with a career opportunist? Well, it would be pretty simple, actually, if that's what you were trying to do. But you must be after something else, because making yourself the first in history on a huge vote to do something is a pretty good play for an opportunist. But I don't understand why you can't understand it.
Right. I don't know.
I'll be cynical and say that. So even the cynics were unable to be properly cynical. Everybody screwed it up. All right. Everyone's
but you can take a look at it and say
a Byron York app.
All sorts of things. I mean, I see other, Jonathan Adler, who's one of the conservative legal eagles who follows all of this, and I like following him.
I like saying.
So it's an interesting situation. Let's see exactly what he said. And OJ was acquitted too. Of course, that's the analogy that everybody out there in the regular public, not the talking heads, is thinking. I was acquitted. Yeah, OJ was acquitted too. We still all know he's guilty. I mean, and that's the analogy that's going to be forever. But Adler said, in both cases, guilt was clear and the prosecution made mistakes that made it easier to acquit.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, but Jonathan, acquittal wasn't due to prosecution errors. Even if present, nothing. even a perfect presentation would have gotten a conviction with this jury. It's just a hard fact. And guilty he is, and the country knows it. And Jonathan admitted that was true.
Well, there you go. I knew he
would.
But
many of the votes could have been different, he says. Process was run in counterproductive ways. It alienated right-leaning Trump skeptics from the start. And he's referring to not going through court and having the subpoenas for people like Bolton turned down first before you go ahead and impeach.
I see.
The Jonathan Turley argument.
Yes. Well, we did. And we even did it for Bolton.
It's just complete nonsense. And I said back to him, I'm pretty sure it made no difference. The case was compelling, as Lamar Alexander noted. An ire at process is theater, except when you do it. You're a left because you actually care about process. But the guys in the Senate saying, "Oh, I only had to vote to acquit him, not because I wanted to, but because of process," are lying to you.
That is true. And, we pointed out in the show, no one is ever going to catch on with this argument. But we did go to the courts and we did establish the proper procedure for this. And we did do it for Bolton. It's just that it was Josh Bolton that we did it for in 2007 through 2009. And everyone is going to pretend not to remember or that it's somehow inapplicable to this because they were pleading a made-up privilege instead of the actual executive privilege that they pleaded last time. So that's it. So
anyway, one tweeter in response to this conversation I was having with Jonathan Adler said, the incredibly tortured explanations by Collins, Murkowski, Alexander et al. For acquittal suggest that it really wasn't about process. And you know what? Romney made them all look small.
Yeah, that's
at least for a day.
And so good job batting cleanup on that one. Well, definitely. That's the big takeaway from the Romney votes. Maybe over the break I'll dig up links to the conversation because it sounds like a good one. People might want to dig through it and join in unless it's over with. But we'll be back in 2 minutes with our decision on whether or not you get to join. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. All right, well, we've got a hold of that conversation between Greg and Jonathan Adler, and a few people already had jumped in, too. So we'll share that with you in the roundup. And although it looks like it happened, Jonathan started 13 hours ago. So we'll see whether there's room for you. And you responded in time, too.
I talk slow.
It's a conversation between three-toed sloths and a European cave salamander that I just read about in a report somewhere that was alive and hadn't moved for 7.5 years. But then
I can imagine, right? Two cavemen frozen in the ice for 50,000 years, and when they thaw out, they're still arguing.
Right. I can't believe that Neanderthal Iowa caucus worked this way.
Well, maybe we should think about changing it. I don't know. Marie Ivanovich wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post worth noting. These are turbulent times, but we will persist and prevail. Marie Ivanovich is, of course, Profile in Courage. You can nominate her in the JFK Profiles in Courage page. She makes the case when civil servants in the current administration saw senior officials taking actions they considered deeply wrong in regard to the nation of Ukraine, they refused to take part. When Congress asked us to testify about these activities, my colleagues and I did not hesitate, even in the face of administration efforts to silence us. John Bolton, of course, couldn't woman up and do what they did.
True.
So that's notable.
Still won't.
And we did this because it's the American way to speak up about wrongdoing. I have seen dictatorships around the world where blind obedience is the norm and truth tellers are threatened with punishment or death, or heads on pikes, I should add.
Even. Yeah.
We must not allow the United States to become a country where standing up to our government is a dangerous act. So I think that that's true. And again, let's talk about some profiles and courage. Again, I may have gotten this wrong, but I think this was the order. First, Doug Jones announces he's voting to convict.
Okay.
And people looked at that and said, okay, let's go back and look at the Alabama electorate and figure out why Doug Jones is doing this. Because he doesn't have a chance to get reelected. And so what difference does it make to him?
Okay.
And then that's like completely negating who Doug Jones is.
Well,
one of the silly games
for?
I thought was played prior to yesterday's vote were people questioning what Doug Jones was going to do because he said, I really have to sit down and think about it. People who are, let's say, Democrats in red states, of course they're going to say they have to think about it. They can't say, well, I've wanted to do this since day one. That would be a dumb political thing to say. The smart political thing to say is, let me think about it. But Doug Jones, I mean, remember who he is and where he came from and what he did in his career. Of course he was going to vote to do the right thing and uphold the rule of law. And he did. And again, that has to be central to any discussion of why Doug Jones did what he did. If it hurts his re-election chances, so be it.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean...
After that, Mitt Romney
announced
what he was doing. So Jones wasn't pushed by Romney is my point.
Okay.
And I don't think Romney was pushed by Jones.
You don't?
No, I think Romney did what Romney was going to do. Romney was in the office having this conversation with McKay Coppin about, how faith is truly important to him. And if you're going to swear an oath under God, then by God, you're going to do the right thing. And I think that Mitt Romney's father, George, was more in his mind and, being true to himself than anything that Doug Jones had to say.
Well,
now,
Doug Jones,
Romney is Romney, and so, you can't go back and say, okay, I only wish I supported. I don't wish I support Romney. Romney was running against Obama. I was supporting Obama, and I would do it again in a heartbeat if the two ran against each other. But there's no question that the standard bearer for the Republican Party, Mitt Romney,
now,
and the late standard bearer for the Republican Party, John McCain, both would have voted to convict because that's what the Republican Party was in those days.
Yeah.
And it's not the same party anymore, and so the rest of them didn't. Fine, I get that. But Romney did what he did. And then after that, I think the next one to announce was Kirsten Sinema from Arizona.
Yes. Well,
who surprised everybody. A lot of people thought maybe she would split her vote. She didn't.
Right.
And then last to announce was Joe Manchin.
Okay.
Who also, voted to convict.
Yes.
And I think Romney opened the door for them as much as Doug Jones did.
That could be, yes.
So I don't think that, Jones did what he did first. Romney did what he did independent of Jones. But Sinema and Manchin, I just have this feeling. I don't have any proof. I don't have any polling or data or their secret notes or the thing they said to each other in the hall overheard by one of the congressional reporters. But I have a feeling that what Romney and Jones did weighed heavily on what Sinema and Manchin did. And in the end, just don't tell me that it doesn't matter what party they're in. They're all the same. They're not all the same. It matters that Manchin is a Democrat, even though he doesn't always vote with us.
Yes, that is true.
It matters when it matters, and this is one of those things that mattered like more than just about anything else in the world.
I wonder whether they knew that he was going to vote not guilty on the second article. Only Sinema had a chance to hear him do that before casting a vote. I wonder, I had this vision of Joe Manchin say, "What? You can do that? I didn't know that."
Yeah. I have pictures of Manchin going up to who is it, the clerk or somebody, who's responsible for calling the roll.
Yes.
And saying, due to a last minute change, my name begins with Z. It's just silent.
Manchin. Yeah,
So
like
I go
Mnuchin.
last, okay? And let me just hear what everybody else does.
That would have been helpful. I'm sure. I don't know whether Cinema wasn't paying attention, had already made up her mind.
Cinema.
Yeah,
It's
right.
a silent Z there.
But
I
she
go
did come
last.
through
I
with
do
two
Z's.
guilties,
I
even
go
though
after Manchin.
yeah,
I want to see what he does before
people
I
had
do.
questions not only because Arizona, but also because apparently she did some odd and inexplicable.
Well, she stood up and clapped at various and
Yeah,
sundry times
during
in the State of the Union that nobody else did.
Right, and some great pictures of everybody around her going, "Whoa, what are you doing?"
Right.
Like
But
averting
again,
their gaze.
those things are for show. They're for the folks back home. It doesn't matter. What matters is how you voted. And,
That is
you know,
true.
we know how they voted, and that was fine.
Yes, it was written down.
So, you know, if they lean a little bit more to the center or center right than we would like, but they're still part of the Democratic Party, that still matters. They voted the right way when it counts. And unlike Republicans, I guess it was the first one was Don Jr., who said, oh, obviously we have to throw Romney out of the party.
Yes, although he did.
And the rest of
use
the
weird
senators
wording.
said, no.
Yeah, all right. Well, they don't want to be subject
why
to
don't
that
we
test.
why don't we put our Republican majority in jeopardy?
Yes,
Isn't that a good
let's
idea,
do
Mitch?
that.
What do you think?
Sure.
Let's have one less
they
Republican
could probably
senator
survive
for
it
you to
for
work
now.
with. What do you think about that, Mitch?
What did he say?
And Mitch didn't say anything.
Yeah, well, okay.
And then he said, I don't think it's a good idea.
Sure. Also, that guy is not supposed to be really involved in politics. I thought he was busy running the Trump organization.
I thought he was out there explaining how come he, was court sanctioned. I thought that was part of his rehab.
Oh, really? Well,
Explain why your foundation was crooked and what you did that you would never do again.
maybe. No, I will not do that. But I guess there's no work involved in that. Okay.
So, that's basically and the other thing that, again, this is all touchy-feely stuff. It's not data stuff. But I have to tell you, Romney's vote just changed the entire mood yesterday.
Yes, I think so.
We had our mess of a caucus, so no momentum going there. The State of the Union, which Trump did as a Nuremberg rally, very triumphalist. And then we had the OJ acquittal, and it just looked like a bad stretch of 3 days. And
Yes.
Romney said, nope, actually, not only are you guilty, I'm going to go to the floor and explain why.
True, that
And
did
it was like, oh, now,
change things.
you see, the reason for mentioning the Democrats who also voted, the White House was hoping for all four of them.
Yeah.
They wanted Jones, they wanted Sinema, they wanted Manchin especially. They would have settled for at least splitting, yes, no, on the two articles.
Right.
And they never saw Mitt Romney coming. And we know that because they had a planned statement, and then they kicked all the reporters out.
Yes, and then they issued a
They
statement
had
that has nothing to
Glotto
do with
from
it.
Venezuela, and they were going to do a press avail. And then when Romney said, no, he's a crook, can't do it, they threw all the press out. And then they didn't have a statement for 24 hours.
Trump pushed the Diet Coke off of his desk and
Pretty much.
spilled it
And
on
then
the rug.
they spilled it, and then they had to go clean it up.
Yeah.
So, they wanted them. They really badly wanted them. They wanted to be able to say this is completely partisan and no Republican voted for this. And obviously it's all Democrat. They hated me from day one. And Romney spoiled
That's true,
all of
yeah.
that. And for those who, again, the parties are asymmetric. For those who actually want government to function properly, Romney was, hey, this is the way it was supposed to work. So
Right.
it was a big mood shift and a little bit of lightening of the doom and gloom. And then, then the rest of the day followed, and that's what's going from here. So, yeah, I mean, this is OJ. He's acquitted, but we all know he's guilty.
Yes, well,
And I expect Trump to ghostwrite his next book, if I really did it, which he did.
Yeah.
So we'll go from there.
and then
Now,
he can steal his memorabilia
other
back.
thing, there's some great analysis that came down about, for all you polling nerds, something called differential non-response,
Oh, that does sound nerdy. What is it?
right? If a telephone guy calls you,
Yes.
or lady calls you and says, who are you going to vote for in this poll, or do you like this person, do you think they're doing a good job, and you're depressed because your guy isn't doing well, maybe you won't answer the phone.
Oh,
And if you're really excited because your guy just did something wonderful, then you'll answer
Really
twice.
answering the phone. I mean, nothing can make.
It's a pollster. I'm not talking to you. I just don't feel like it. Well, what do you think of Trump?
Yeah.
After that State of the Union, I'm going to pick up the phone and tell you he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So
Okay.
the
Right.
point is that some of the phone responses to the phone polls have Trump going up a couple of points, not anything super dramatic. But for example, Gallup. Gallup had that 49% approval. Gallup has +4 Republicans answering. No other poll has that. Democrats outnumber Republicans. Why did that happen? Maybe it's random error. Maybe it's differential response or non-response. Democrats are depressed and the Republicans are happy, so they were more than happy to call into, C-SPAN.
Ah, yes. Well, they never stop with that.
Right.
All right.
So
Interesting.
the idea and what they're seeing is that the online panel polls, which actually did very well in terms of predicting what was going on in Iowa,
Yeah.
aren't changing that much. Like our civics poll,
I
for
see.
example.
So that's the reason for the theory.
So the civics poll, the poll that never changes, doesn't change because the public opinion really hasn't changed. But the telephone polls, the old gold standard,
Yeah.
may actually wind up being a little bit more variable because they depend upon people's mood as to whether or not they answer the phone and answer the poll.
Could be.
And
I don't want
they're
answering the phone.
diverging. In other words, they were pretty steady. They were both getting the same response, and then all of a sudden, now the telephone polls are favoring Trump, whereas the online panel polls really haven't changed at all.
Yes. And by telephone
And-
polls, we don't mean the wooden ones.
No. So it's an interesting. Just keep that in the back of your mind. So if Gallup shows Trump all of a sudden surging, hang your hats on that. Don't.
And
Okay.
hang the
Just
phone
wait
up.
and see what the averages are looking at. And as we speak, I think what I'll do is I'll go over to 538 and take a look at what the averages actually look at.
Yeah.
And it's a slight improvement for Trump. 43.7 now, improve, and disapprove is
telephone polls.
51.9, but well in line with what he normally does. So for the past 2 months, he's maybe picked up a point, and that doesn't change everything.
Right. Well, true. That's an interesting theory. It seems like maybe that's just another form of enthusiasm
Yeah,
measurement.
exactly.
But yeah, okay. Well, like
And
are they security
transient
moms
is
or
the
soccer
point.
moms?
That is not a
moms.
take it to the bank between now and November.
No. That would be a very minor shading of a measure that doesn't matter very much, for one thing.
Right?
But
I'm just sending you
yeah.
the picture so you can
That's
see what it looks
interesting.
like.
That is a polling
nothing
nerd
dramatic
thing.
here.
You said it was for nerds.
Yep. But,
All right.
don't freak out when you see, oh, my God, Gallup said that. That doesn't mean
Right.
much really
Don't
at the
freak out.
moment.
Talk to
It's
a
not
nerd.
like you should unskew the poll and ignore it. Just look at the averages as always. Look at the aggregates and understand that if you have a point up or a point down, it doesn't change the nature of everything. So there you have it.
Okay. All right. I will accept that explanation as helpful and instructive. If you're freaking out, talk to a nerd. Is always a good rule. Speak to nerds, really, honestly. Don't leave them out there hanging. Oh, all right.
Abby
Dogs,
says
too.
I'm done.
All right. Very good. Time to go to work for your neighbor.
I am. And I am Sam. Sam, I am. I will talk to you on Monday.
All right.
And that'll
Woof,
be before
woof
the
as
Tuesday New Hampshire primaries,
Yes.
which aren't caucuses. And
Yeah,
we'll
they
have
might as
more
well
on the
be.
tracking polls, and we'll see what they say, and we'll see who's up and who's down and what goes on.
All right. Why don't we plan to do that?
But say nice things about Mitt Romney, and you don't have to take back anything you said about him in the past.
Oh, okay. Yesterday's first vote was pretty good.
Yep.
All right.
Take care,
Very
and
good.
I'll talk to you.
Thank you. We'll talk to you next week when it
It's
is
all about process,
New
you know.
Hampshire time. Right. The process is we'll talk next week.
Bye.
All right. Very good. Thanks. Appreciate it, Greg. And yeah, a good roundup at this point. Yeah, I kind of like that. Well, I'm not certain that it means anything, but I love the nuance of the idea of differential non-response. I don't know so much about not answering the phone, although that's that would be a pretty depressed person if they were not answering the phone when they normally would because they were depressed about something that had happened politically. Versus I don't answer the phone anymore because I don't want to talk to anybody, or everything that calls me. At this point, if you have a landline, if you're like me, 90% of the calls are garbage and you don't answer them. And in campaign season specifically, you don't answer them because you don't want to answer polls. So now, I guess if you hear it's a pollster and pick up the phone, or you pick up the phone out of habit anyway, then you and then hear it's a pollster and say, I don't want to answer a poll. That's a pretty clear thing. Or I'm so enthusiastic about answering a poll because I want to talk about how great my candidate is. That's certainly true. Caller ID is another, I guess, factor in that. Although I discount it all the time because I don't have it, and I've never had it, and I don't care. And then we got a phone, an actual physical phone system that assumes that you do have caller ID, but it doesn't identify anything. So it doesn't help me any. So I never think about caller ID. And most, I mean, I guess most of the, I don't know, does caller ID probably wouldn't identify. Do pollsters put their ID in? Then how does it even work? I've never used the damn thing. So like ours now, my phone, every time the phone rings, just says in a computerized voice, call from, right? And I'm thinking, who, right? Every call from private caller. Call from private caller. And I have a phone that there's a phone book in it, and you can put in people's phone numbers. But I guess it's only for speed dialing them, because when those numbers that I've programmed in and put a name to call, I still get call from private caller. And I don't know whether that's the phone I have doesn't work. Caller ID must work at some level, right? Otherwise, they would have abandoned it a long time ago. So I don't know. I guess if you get a call on your phone and the caller ID says that it's a pollster, I would be astonished by that. But I don't know why pollsters would hide their identity. I don't know if it. Do you think it changes your polling outcome? I mean, I guess if you're a believer in differential non-response theory, then you might think that there's a differential response rate, too, from identifying yourself. You need to be able to take people by surprise in order to get an accurate poll. I don't know. Just sort of an interesting question for another, I was going to say another day, but probably another show, quite honestly. Like, I mean, a different program. I don't know. I guess we could spend some time on it. But it's an interesting thought. Much more interesting things happening elsewhere, of course, than just that, and whether caller ID affects anything. But anyway, let's see. Where can I find all of these great stories? And the answer is some of them are in the last couple minutes of my Twitter feed from this morning, figuring out what was up in the news this morning, and the rest is all in Pocket. So let's skip over to that direction. And there was some Iowa discussion that I thought was of some interest that ended up retweeted into my stream here that I think has overstated the case. But it was offered up to us by a checkmark kind of fellow from the Washington Post. Is that right? Vincent Bevins, with whom I am not familiar, but his Twitter bio says he's no longer with the Washington Post, apparently. He's working on a book, and that's great because people love books, apparently. And this book that he's working on comes after, as he says, a couple of years covering Southeast Asia for the Washington Post. And before that, I mean, he's worked all over the place. LA Times in Brazil, Financial Times in London, but now working on his book in California, and I'm sure enjoying the beautiful weather, although he's probably not awake yet. Today's, yeah, I guess he is. He's awake real early in California, and maybe he's been up all night working on his book. But he says this in a relatively short Twitter thread. It's important to remember, he says, that you don't actually win power from the Iowa caucus. And I said, that's a good point. Let's read on. It's about creating momentum and getting your moment in the media. That is true, too. So essentially, they canceled the Iowa caucus a few hours after everyone voted. And I thought, well, all right. That sort of makes a certain amount of sense. He went on from there to say, for thousands of people who went out there to canvass for their candidates, that is obviously deeply demoralizing. And I thought, well, it is demoralizing. I don't know how deeply demoralizing, but maybe. I mean, you really throw yourself into it. Sure, why not? I'll keep reading. So instead of getting a media victory, he says, the message was, you just have to keep trying elsewhere. Okay. And you can't count on the system or the media to help you. And I thought there, well, now we may be overstating the case a little bit. He continues and says, that might be a message that is actually true, one that campaigners actually need to hear. Maybe. But it is a very troubling one for those concerned about U.S. democracy as a whole. We know that the perceived legitimacy of democratic systems is basically the same as their legitimacy. It's a real mess, and the loser is not just Bernie, unfairly, he writes parenthetically, or Biden, who he says would have lost anyways. It's faith in U.S. democracy, not only within the country, but worldwide. And so I thought, okay, that may be a point that's too broad, but I like parts of this, and we should probably go back and look at that. I think the first tweet there, the strongest. Important to remember, you don't actually win power from the Iowa caucus. You don't. There's 41 delegates out of 3,000 at stake there. It makes not a bit of difference in the world with respect, mathematically, with respect to the nomination. It is, as he says, all about creating momentum and getting your moment in the media. Okay. So we should talk about that a little bit because that's exactly what it is. What it really means to me is that the Iowa caucuses have always been something of a campaign hack. And I don't mean campaign hack in the sense of all the old campaign hacks in Iowa always get work every 4 years campaigning for one or another candidate. It's not the people that I'm talking about who are old hacks, you know, and some of them are great people. They're all great people. I don't know. You got to be very dedicated to do this sort of thing. I don't know. Maybe they're all terrible people. Don't ask me questions like that. I don't know them personally. But the point is, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about hacking a campaign in the sense that we talk about Donald Trump hacking the media or hacking campaigns. Well, when he's hacking campaigns, we're talking about him cheating in campaigns. So really hacking the media, making the media do the things you want them to do to make you look like a bigger deal than you really are. And that's what Iowa really is all about. The whole thing, it's not even that old of a tradition. And every time I hear people go over it and complain about it, every 4 years or so, I'm reminded. I think that what was 1976 the first time that we had the Iowa First in the Nation caucuses, and then they produced Jimmy Carter out of nowhere as a leader, and then he just rode that momentum. Do I remember that correctly? I might not even have that correct at all. But the whole idea of the Iowa caucuses seemed to me was it was a small-ish state, population-wise, a small-ish slice of the small-ish population involved in the Democratic Party, and you got an even smaller slice if you went with the caucus thing. And maybe Iowa always went with caucuses. I don't remember. I don't know. I don't care, quite honestly. But because all I'm interested in is the time during which they have used caucuses. And they are manipulable. Is that a correct form of the word? I think what makes the Iowa caucuses interesting to people, to candidates, and their approach to it, not only that it's the first in the nation thing means that you get the first headline and big photo saying so-and-so wins. And now you're a winner, right? And you don't smell like garlic, as Greg was pointing out. So whoever the winner is gets to ride some momentum. Sometimes it works in New Hampshire. Lately, it usually has not produced the same winner twice for various reasons. But the point is you get the first blank so-and-so is a winner headline, and that's a big deal. And it makes people, not so much in New Hampshire, but in other states, say, I will now give that person another look. They were one of 100 people that could be, viable, or just probably didn't look all that viable, but now they are, because they have a win in the win column. They have a notch in the win column. And I say it was a hackable thing because it was so focused on the retail politics thing. You could spend a year there. You had people moving to the state, as Chris Dodd did, in order to spend more time there and, bragging about things the way Rick Santorum. I've been to all 99 counties in Iowa. And I guess I only know that Iowa has 99 counties because he made such a big deal out of it. And you go to diners and you're this and that, and the caucuses are small. And if you recruit good people, and these are all valid campaign skills. So it was always kind of okay with the party apparatus and media coverage people and campaign types of all stripes, because it emphasized what were traditional campaign skills. You had to organize, you had to meet people, you had to be good at retail politics. And maybe this was the only place where that really mattered, besides possibly New Hampshire. And so the point is that if you got the right people signed up and you put the right amount of resources into things, you could organize things in such a way that you have just enough people to go to just enough caucuses to win just enough delegates, or have just enough people in, your corner, such that when the formula was used, you got rounded up and you picked up extra delegates here and there, and you magnified your impact. And suddenly somebody like, let's say, Pete Buttigieg, who was, a name and had made a name for himself through other traditional campaigning means, the advertising and the debates and the interviews and the PR campaign, et cetera, et cetera. But now you have, you get the big headline, so-and-so wins, or comes in really close second, sometimes is even enough when they're willing to write the Iowa caucuses off for various reasons. Like, for instance, if a senator from Iowa is running. They've done that in the past. So it was hackable. So maybe we all devalued it from the beginning, and when we needed to dismiss it, we did. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So you get what I'm saying here is that basically it was an opportunity for a smallish campaign that didn't have a lot of money yet to amplify its message, to come in first or even perform very, very well, but not come in first place in Iowa was a big deal and will get you a lot of headlines. So it was bang for the buck sort of thing. And then, of course, people began pouring enormous amounts of resources into Iowa because, it was no longer a measure of bang for the buck. It was just a measure of bang. So it didn't really matter how much bucks you put into it. And I don't know, maybe things went off the rails there, but it was clearly, I don't know. It was clearly always a stunt of sorts. But it was, at the beginning, an acceptable sort of stunt, because in order to pull it off, you had to do things that were traditionally of value in a campaign anyway. But maybe that time has passed. Maybe the hacking has gone too far. Maybe we've dismissed it too often. I guess, like I said, I don't remember exactly what the full history of the importance of the Iowa caucuses were, but for some reason it sticks in my mind that 1976 was some sort of watershed moment that the Iowa caucuses lifted Jimmy Carter out of obscurity, and then everybody woke up. It was a different era then, and a lot more people then got their political news from the three major networks and their local newspapers, so that when they and there wasn't quite as much, I don't think, emphasis. If you watched your news, TV news, national news even, at home, there wasn't quite as much emphasis on, here's our reporter embedded in Iowa telling you what's going on in the diners and living rooms in Iowa for weeks on end. All of a sudden, when the voting started and people started to pay attention, they picked up the newspaper, or the national news said, well, the winner was Jimmy Carter. And, all right, I guess I'll give some thought to this Jimmy Carter fella. Why not? That's where news came from, and news said this. Now that's not even remotely the case. First of all, everybody is the news. It's not that the news is not trying mightily to make themselves, to retain for themselves that kind of importance. That's why they're embedding all these people and sending everybody to Iowa. It's just that there's so many news sources now, and people don't have to wait for the newspaper to arrive or for the evening news to come on to get word about anything that's happening in Iowa for any of the candidates, and they can pick their own candidates and follow them. I don't know. I mean, I certainly wasn't following campaigns the same way in 1976, but I never got the sense, I followed them somewhat as I grew older through the 80s and into the 90s, and I never really got the same sense that I get lately of people nationally being early adopters of a candidate and for instance, shipping out for Iowa to do door knocking and canvassing to help organize. But I think that's legit in a way. It's a little weird, but that's a way of hacking the campaign hack. You know what I mean? We'll bring in extra people to knock on doors, and if we can just bring out enough bodies here and there, we can outperform, we can punch above our weight and move up higher and get more notice. And it was a reasonable gamble to take. What we ought to be doing now, I guess, that for all the conditions that have changed, I would think it's still wise to have the first contest be a contest of traditional campaign skills, but maybe it's no longer all that wise to say, if you are I don't know. I mean, I guess like the small campaigns and long shot candidates, they would argue differently. And someone might argue that small d democracy depends on the ability of unknown candidates to make their case and rise to the top. And that's something to think about. But if the first contest were an enormous and very diverse state that relies on the sort of skills that one would have to exhibit in order to win the national campaign in the general election, well, then you might have a very different contest on your hands, and it would be conducted differently, and it might be more predictive of success in the general election. But I don't know, what the hell, it might not be. You never know. And if you can have lightning strike for a candidate, then anything, I guess, is possible. But lightning has to strike for somebody that's electrifying as opposed to not all that interesting. And, I don't know. But I certainly found the Vincent Bevins thread to overstate the case in terms of this is enormously, deeply demoralizing, and you can't count on the system to help you. I don't know that that's really a fair assessment of things. A better assessment was the first half of that second tweet that says, it might be that for thousands of people who went out there to canvass, it's obviously demoralizing, maybe not so deeply, but instead of getting immediate victory, the message is you've got to keep trying elsewhere. Well, all right. That's not such a bad message. I think we give that message to people all the time. Well, you didn't win, but that doesn't mean you're out of it. Maybe you should keep trying elsewhere. Anyway, I don't know. The history of Iowa has been varied and weird. And I do remember thinking in the early 90s, when I was much more politically aware than in 1976. But even as a kid in 1976, I was relatively politically aware. For instance, I do remember that my dad was, I remember who he wanted to win in the primaries, and it wasn't Jimmy Carter. He was a Frank Church supporter, I guess, probably left over from the church committee's hearings, and that he valued them very, the work that Frank Church had done very highly. And why should I remember that? And I guess I guess that's only proof of the fact that, how old was I? 1976. I'm like 8 years old. Normally, I guess 8-year-olds don't remember very much about what was going on in the primaries at the time. But I do, because it was discussed around the house. So I remember it pretty well. But it wasn't until the early 90s where I first saw, and it's not that many primaries in between 76 and then, right? 76 and then 80 when it was Carter running for re-election, but I guess there was the Kennedy challenge, so that was a pretty serious thing. Ordinarily, you would discount it when there was a re-election bid going on. 84, 88, and then 92, because 92 is what I'm talking about. So the fifth time around, I guess that's a lot. It wasn't until the fifth time around in Iowa, or watching Iowa for me, that I first saw anybody say, oh yeah, Iowa might not really be all that important after all. And that was because, and I realized this was the first time I ever did anything by way of early adoption of a candidate. And I thought, oh, you know what? Maybe this will work out really great. In late 1989, not 99, but 91, I would have apparently said to myself, well, Tom Harkin, he's a good guy, and he's running for president. And you know what? The Iowa caucuses are so important. He's from Iowa. He's the senator from Iowa. He'll win the Iowa caucuses, and then that's it, right? You win the Iowa caucuses, you're the front runner, and then you go. And for him, then the hacking would be done in New Hampshire. If you just pour all your resources into New Hampshire now, you'll be able to win Iowa and then New Hampshire, and then you got momentum to spare, and you're on your way, and you're going to be the president. So, well, I don't know. I mean, it wasn't. I don't think Tom Harkin wasn't good candidate or presidential material, but I don't know that I was necessarily at that point in love with the Harkin message, but it wasn't a bad one. But it was more along the lines of, oh, well, maybe I'll be able to predict who'll win, actually. Well, so I said, all right, well, let's go for it. See what happens with Harkin running in Iowa. And what immediately happened was all the rest of the candidates said, that's not fair. Iowa can't be the state that decides everything because he's from Iowa. So Iowa doesn't count this time. It's a write-off. I'm not even going to Iowa, or whatever happens in Iowa doesn't matter. It's an automatic lock for Harkin. The real contest is in New Hampshire, and everybody just went to hack New Hampshire instead. And now we'll talk in those diners and go into those living rooms instead of the Iowa ones. And, well, you know what happened. Harkin did not win the nomination. So, I don't know. Iowa has always sort of been a fake thing and a fake phenomenon from the beginning, and the beginning wasn't even all that long ago. So, I don't know. I wouldn't put that much. I certainly wouldn't get to the point where I would be tweeting out, you should abandon all hope in democracy, even if you went to Iowa. I mean, how many times have we seen this? The Dean troops in orange hats go to Iowa. It didn't work out. Okay. It hasn't worked out for a while. And I don't think Iowa has predicted the winner for quite a while. So, in either party. So, I don't know. I guess that's just my way of saying, if you didn't have a good Iowa experience this time, don't worry about it. Iowa is a lot less interesting than you think in terms of predicting the winners and even in the momentum game. Sometimes they just say it doesn't even count. So, if they say it didn't count back then, you can say it doesn't count now. How about that? I'll offer you that possibility. All right. Let's see. I know there's some other stories that we wanted to do. I know there's other things we wanted to talk about. Let's find them and scroll back. What else was happening this morning that caught my attention? I guess this was, mostly I guess that was the Matt Gaetz thing. I should find that, a note to self to find that Gaetz tweet with the notarized letter in it. That's pretty dumb. I would like to find out, I'm not certain about this, whether there's any germ of truth in the story that Gaetz and other Republicans are telling. They are contending that what Nancy Pelosi was given was not merely some random printout of the planned text of the president's speech, but some sort of official document that was, destined to be filed with the clerk of the House and archived for all time, et cetera, et cetera. Or, then it was mentioned, it's a signed copy of it. And I don't know. I mean, it may be the case that traditionally the president does hand over a signed copy of the planned text of his address to the speaker and to the vice president. I don't know whether it's like a souvenir for being the important person who gets to sit in the chair behind me while I give this important address, or whether it's supposed to have some official weight or not. I mean, I guess it's possible, since the State of the Union is mentioned in the Constitution, though it's not necessarily an annual event and doesn't necessarily have to be delivered in person. Had traditionally was, for most of our history, delivered in writing. I suppose that's possible that he was handing over, the written version of it, but I don't know. Nothing in my reading of the Constitution says that there's any particular weight given to her copy. There might be something statutory. I don't know. But anyway, so now the Republican theory here is that she's destroyed some important document that, I don't know, that I guess basically they're just going to have to tape back together, because that's what they do over at the White House. Trump is tearing things up all the time. And as we mentioned yesterday, there's a couple of people whose job it is to spend the whole day taping things back together when he tears them in half. What Gates has done, of course, is not a thing. And the fact that he had his letter notarized, which is also, I mean, you can have things notarized, but it doesn't make your letter any more true or weighty or official or anything like that. If you, as a member of Congress, write a letter to the Ethics Committee, as he said he did, calling for an ethics investigation into the tearing of this paper, it doesn't need to be notarized in order to be, you're going to get the same newsworthiness out of it, whether it's notarized or not. And if it's based on the substance of the letter, the content of the letter, in this case, you shouldn't get any, because, okay, you're referring something to the Ethics Committee the Ethics Committee isn't going to care about. Fine. But I would like to learn. I'll see if I can't do some research to see if there's any reason to believe that there's official weight to the copy that she was given. Anyway, I thought that was of some interest. We always like to try to uncover those things. All right, let's see. Other interesting items for consideration today. Let's see. Of course, there's news that the House Judiciary Committee, in the person of, in this case, of Jerry Nadler, according to the New York Times anyway, says that they are likely to follow up on the impeachment work by subpoenaing John Bolton. I believe Bolton has already made some sort of unofficial response indicating that he simply would not comply. No real explanation given as to why he says he would have testified to the Senate had they subpoenaed him, but will not testify to the House. And it may be because it's not important enough and it's no longer in the context of impeachment. But I don't know. I think they should. Why not? Just maybe they should spend some time trying to address the concerns of people like Jonathan Adler, who Greg was conversing with, and say, all right, if you think that there was a procedural defect, we could just start the process all over again. And I am getting mixed signals from people about whether or not the Democrats would actually press to do something that would result in a second impeachment, or the opening at least of a second impeachment inquiry. They really should. They should leverage that, and it would drive Trump crazy. But it's very difficult for me to picture Nancy Pelosi committing to it. However, I do have other commentators who are saying, "Oh, you don't understand. This is war now." She demonstrated her resolve in tearing this thing up, and she may very well keep the door open to something like that, which would be great. I really hope that they do. I'm very pleased, as I keep repeating on Twitter, that we have gotten past the "we don't have the votes" excuse on questions of impeachment. And maybe it's only for Donald Trump, but it should have been the case for George W. Bush too, when it was, for us to now be saying, well, we can't rely on the probable outcome of the Senate vote in determining whether or not we're going to do the right thing here. And maybe, the most cynical reading of this is that it's of great value in the election, and he's going to have to run as damaged goods, and we can campaign against him using this. Even though it may rally his troops, we think it can rally ours as well, and we're doing it for that reason. But to the extent that we take everybody at their word that this was because it was necessary and the right thing to do, I wonder where that resolve was when the question was torture and warrantless surveillance and all of the other various things that the George W. Bush administration was guilty of, but which, for which all the dismissal was always, well, we don't have the votes. We didn't have the votes this time either, but you found the resolve to do it. And I hope that that's the case forever into the future, because as I promised you when the George W. Bush era came to a close, this will happen again, and it will happen again very quickly, because the very next Republican president will do it. We may be enjoying a honeymoon of 4, 8, 12, who knows, 16 years of Democratic presidencies following this, or none, and be right back where we started. But the next Republican will pick up where this one left off. And that's even worse of a warning than it was when it was George W. Bush we were talking about, because you really have to go crazy to pick up on where Donald Trump left off and get even crazier. But why wouldn't you do it is the real question. Because if you can get away with it, why wouldn't you do anything? And at the time after George W. Bush, I guess not enough people contemplated what anything really meant, because Donald Trump was the answer to that. We just didn't know it yet. Anyway, so let's see where to take you with that. So I'm glad that they've got that in mind. And let's see, I'll see if I can find the actual article about it. I probably can't, because it was it was a blurb in the ongoing impeachment-related scroll at the New York Times, but perhaps they've, published something since that will put it in a fixed place. So there, note to self to look for that. But here we are. With the Senate trial over, House Democrats signal that they will, quote, likely subpoena John Bolton. There's a superfluous word in there that I had to edit out. Short blurb. I guess we can share it here, I think, before moving on to some other subjects, and maybe returning to the weird Burisma story that I began sharing with you yesterday. I think that one's very important, so I might want to give time over to that. Just because it's over does not mean it's actually over, says the Times reporting here. Hours before the Senate ended President Trump's trial, a senior House Democrat indicated that he would continue the investigation on his side of the Capitol, starting with a subpoena for John R. Bolton, the president's former national security advisor. It's Representative Gerald Nadler, Democrat of New York, speaking here, and chair of the House Judiciary Committee. He told reporters he would likely subpoena Mr. Bolton, who has confirmed in an unpublished book that Mr. Trump conditioned security aid on Ukraine's willingness to investigate the president's Democratic rivals, the central allegation of the trial. I think it's a likely yes, said Mr. Nadler, one of the 7 House managers prosecuting the charges against Mr. Trump. When you have a lawless president, you have to bring that to the fore. You have to spotlight that. You have to protect the Constitution despite the political consequences. And we'll say Nadler was as close to supporting impeachment of George W. Bush as most Democrats were allowed to get last time around. So it's not terribly surprising that he might think that this is the right thing to do. No word on whether he has the leadership behind him, though. The House asked Mr. Bolton to testify before the December impeachment vote, but he didn't agree, and Democrats opted not to subpoena him. Well, I think they subpoenaed him and then withdrew, or maybe that was the Kupperman that they actually withdrew the subpoena at the time. Anyway, they opted not to subpoena him because it could result in a lengthy court fight. When the articles of impeachment reached the Senate, however, Bolton publicly said he would comply with the Senate subpoena and testify if called, but they blocked it. The Republicans blocked it, as you know. Not clear whether Bolton would be willing to comply with the subpoena without a court fight if issued by the House outside the context of an impeachment trial. A spokeswoman for Mr. Bolton had no comment on Wednesday. Even if he did, Trump could assert executive privilege to try to block his testimony, provoking that very legal battle that Democrats hoped to avoid. But I would say we go for it anyway. We'll see whether that happens. We'll see whether he is serious or not. I think that Bolton was playing some games. Not entirely sure that he meant to perjure himself and felt safer doing so in front of the Senate, which is Republican controlled, than in front of the House, which is Democratic controlled. But he's clearly screwing around in some respect, and I don't know whether he feels that he needs any redemption at this stage. He might just be happy to wait for books and book sales to do the talking for him. All right. I thought that was, we should bring that up, though, and leave that out there. By the way, over on the Senate side, you have various Republican senators, including Lindsey Graham, saying, who, by the way, chairs the Judiciary Committee on the Senate side, saying that it's his intention to begin investigations on, and we can use this as a segue, on Burisma, Ukraine, Hunter Biden, etc. He threatens, I don't know whether he's serious or not, but he threatens to try to, continue the Republican drive to get to the bottom of what happened in 2016 and prove this theoretical counter narrative that it really was Ukraine was interfering in the election, and maybe also Russia, but mostly Ukraine, and that there was some deep plot to use Ukraine in some way to discredit Republicans and to fix the election in favor of Democrats, except they forgot to develop the plan for how to do it or execute it or anything. I don't know. But you understand the theory. And I guess also somewhere buried under all of this is the idea that somehow everything that led to even the Mueller investigation was planned, plotted, and planted by Democrats, and somehow subpoenaing Hunter Biden is going to uncover all of this. I'm not exactly certain what they think that connection is. Maybe you have some clearer idea about it. But I would say that it's virtually impossible to have such an idea. That gives me a chance, our break is coming up, but maybe we can get started in resuming the reading of yesterday's long read, which will now stretch into today's long read, from The Guardian, The Money Machine, How a High-Profile Corruption Investigation Fell Apart. This is the Oliver Bullough, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, story in The Guardian from way, way back, April 12th, 2017. And to recap, if you're just joining us and didn't listen yesterday, in which case I will wrap you across the knuckles, the story basically to this point is that in 2014, post-Ukrainian revolution that ousted the Yanukovych regime, the Western democracies, and in this case in particular the UK, threw their weight behind an effort to redeem themselves for their guilty conscience, I guess, in participating in the Western world's second most popular sport, laundering money for dictators of developing countries around the world who steal from their country and loot their countries and hide their money in Western and offshore banks. And offshore is our responsibility, despite the fact that we pretend it's elsewhere. Very often it's American territories or British territories or former British territories. Anyway, with all the secretive banking laws, though the Eastern Europe has developed some of its own as well. And then there's always the Swiss banks. But anyway, the point was that there was a PR campaign on in the UK to redouble efforts to try to fight corruption of the sort that had plagued Ukraine. The Yanukovych regime broke all the world records, apparently, in terms of the breadth and depth of their corruption. And they had stolen and moved out of the country far, far more than any other similarly situated corrupt regime to date. And at that point, they found that a small chunk, $23 million worth, small chunk of what was actually looted was being hidden in a bank in London, a French bank branch in London, and they were going to say, all right, no more of this enabling the looting of Ukraine in particular, and I don't know whether they were really going to do it for any other countries, but for Ukraine in particular, and we're going to step forward and we're going to prosecute this thing seriously. And it turned out that the $23 million they were talking about belonged to the very oligarch who owned Burisma. And that brings us to this segue we'll get back to in 2 minutes. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And it reminds me, by the way, that I guess we'll get to the coverage tomorrow, the president's performance apparently at the National Prayer Breakfast has been something of a debacle and a disgrace. But of course, I'm sure his fans love it, and the media will talk about how he's made it his own or reshaped it in his image or whatever. But we'll get to that. And, of course, he's apparently going to follow this whole thing up with a noon event of some kind today addressing the close of the impeachment proceedings, in which I assume he will also further embarrass himself in the face of dignified company, but endear himself to his fans. So you should be bracing for that. In the meantime, I will give you more information about the background of the Burisma claims, so that you're able to better evaluate that. If I don't know, I mean, it might even make you think about reviving this part of the investigation too, especially if Lindsey Graham does decide to go forward. You might think this is outdated and useless information now, but on the off chance that Lindsey Graham goes forward, or as long as the Biden campaign persists, this, I guess, is worth having. But I just found it very interesting, because my big question was, well, what did Burisma supposedly do anyway? So I guess some further background and reminder before we pick up where we left off. And we didn't leave off at a natural breaking point here, and we probably won't do it this time either. Here's what I've got here. So we also reminded everybody, all right, there's $23 million at stake. It's being frozen by the UK government. The Serious Fraud Office in the UK is after it. It's in the bank account of a Mykola Zlochevsky. And by the way, I'll give you the spelling of it so you can decide whether I'm pronouncing it wrong and look it up on your own if you want. Mykola Zlochevsky is the oligarch, the corrupt oligarch behind the corrupt Burisma company, and some others too. He's got a bunch of different interests. Mykola, Mykola in this rendering. Zlochevsky, Zlochevsky. So here's the guy. They describe him here. Remember from yesterday, a large man with a shaved head. Zlochevsky wears boxy suits, dislikes fastening the top button of his shirt, and has been a fixture in Ukraine's public life for 2 decades. And the issue here was Zlochevsky was not only a quote-unquote businessman, and one of his businesses, and I guess the chief business, was this Burisma natural gas company in Ukraine, drilling and distribution. I don't know what other parts of the distribution chain he might have been involved in. He also apparently has like luxury goods store, like a department store of some kind that's actually named after him. And why he still wears boxy suits, I don't know, but it's mostly about shoes and watches, I think, if I recall correctly. Anyway, he's been in and out of Ukrainian government along with what's his name, Yanukovych, the extraordinarily corrupt Ukrainian politician who was in government as prime minister and then later as president. And Zlochevsky came in and out of government with him, serving in roles in which he would have a direct hand in benefiting his natural gas interests in Burisma. So obviously it gives rise to the suspicion of corruption. Plus, of course, he was making an awful lot of money. And it was argued, well, he was a wealthy man before he came into government. That doesn't necessarily rule out corruption as the road to those riches. But certainly once you combine the personal ownership of a natural gas company with the ministry, control of the ministry for energy and natural resources, you would be excused for presuming that there was a serious conflict of interest there. And if he also increases his personal wealth enormously at the time, you're probably right. So where do we leave off here? There was at this point, the UK Serious Fraud Office in 2014 is saying, we think that the $23 million that we've traced to Zlochevsky, that's sitting in the BNP Paribas Bank branch in London, we think it belongs to him. It's owned, the account is owned been passed through a chain of LLCs registered offshore, and we don't have, those countries don't require naming who controls those things, but we think we've managed to trace it to Zlochevsky, and we're going to sue, and hopefully this will be the first of many times where we find looted funds from Ukraine, freeze them, prove that they were stolen, and return them to the new government of Ukraine, the post-Yanukovych government of Ukraine, that they will use to rebuild Ukraine, which has collapsed under the weight of the Yanukovych theft. We mentioned also yesterday the fact that it came into Yanukovych came into office, Ukraine came into independence with an economy the size of Poland's, and it had collapsed to about a third of that size due to the pervasive corruption. So Trump's not wrong in saying that Ukraine has had enormous problems with governmental corruption. What he's wrong about is how to root that corruption out, among other things. So they think they've got Zlochevsky nailed here, so they sue. They go to try and take the money. And remember, part of what they're hoping to do here is rebuild Ukraine with a post-Yanukovych government that will hopefully be a lot less corrupt, but that will also hopefully cost Western democracies a lot less to rebuild if they can rebuild it with seized, stolen funds that get returned to Ukraine. Ukraine will need a lot less help from the West in terms of cash if we could find and return the looted money to them. Right? So there's a pretty good reason for going after all of this. Anyway, and we left off somewhere around here, so we'll pick up here. It is true that Zlochevsky was a wealthy man before 2010 when he first came into government with Yanukovych. Burisma's website makes it clear that in the periods where it has performed best have consistently coincided with high points, though, in Zlochevsky's political career. During a previous Yanukovych government in 2003 to 2005, Zlochevsky chaired the State Committee for Natural Resources, and companies under his control won licenses to explore for oil. Yanukovych then falls from grace. The new government tried to strip Zlochevsky's companies of their oil exploration rights, and he had to sue the government in order to keep them. Yanukovych comes back, wins the presidency in 2010. Zlochevsky becomes a minister. Good times returned. Burisma is doing gangbusters. After the revolution, Yanukovych flees to Where? Russia. And Zlochevsky also leaves the country and leaves the government, of course, but because there's a revolution. I thought that was a weird statement. Like, after the revolution, Zlochevsky left the administration. Yeah, because the administration left the country. Anyway, according to a court judgment from January of 2015, the $23 million in the account that had been frozen in London was the proceeds of the sale of an oil storage facility which Zlochevsky had owned via a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. Tax haven, of course, and they don't reveal who controls the companies that are based there. So they managed to prove it nonetheless. The $23 million arrived in London from Latvia, a minimally regulated Eastern European country, where banks are famously welcoming toward money from the former Soviet Union. On April 14th, 2014, the money was frozen at a special court hearing in London, requested by the Serious Fraud Office. As described in the later court judgment, the SFO argued that there were reasonable grounds to believe that the defendant, Zlochevsky, had engaged in criminal conduct in Ukraine, and the funds of the BNP account were believed to be the proceeds of such criminal conduct. SFO investigator Richard Gould claimed in the April 2014 court hearing that Zlochevsky's dual position in Ukraine gave rise to a clear inference of a willful and dishonest exploitation of a direct conflict of interest by a man holding an important public office, such as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in him. And I asked you if that sounded familiar. The SFO further argued that the complicated pattern of offshore holding companies established that while he was still serving as a minister, he was effectively doing so to conceal his beneficial ownership of Burisma, or rather, that he was using shell companies to conceal the fact that he still ran Burisma, even though he was a minister, right? That, too, the SFO deemed inherently suspicious. Then, let's see, there was a turnover in May of 2014 of thousands of electronic documents from the bank related to Zlochevsky's money, and the investigators a special team to examine them. He also wanted evidence from Ukraine. So, here's where it starts to get interesting. He wrote to the head of the International Department of the General Prosecutor's Office, Vitaly Kasko, in Kyiv. Right? You want to do an investigation. The proper way to do it is not to threaten them or insist that they do the investigation or just announce it. You write to them and say, we'd like your help. Now, who is Vitaly Kasko? Well, first we've got to find out that he's a lean man with a sharp chin and luxuriant head of black hair. Why that matters, I don't know. But it's a long article and they wanted to spice it up. Kasko had, not Costco, but Kasko, K-A-S-K-O, had been invited to into the prosecutor's office after the revolution. That's good news, right? And made responsible for negotiations with all the Western countries that had promised to help at the London summit. You remember the summit where they all said we should do this and it would help pay for rebuilding Ukraine? He had previously served as a prosecutor, but had quit when Yanukovych came to power in 2010. This ensured that Kasko was personally untainted by corruption, or at least Yanukovych's corruption. He was also popular with activists since he had provided legal support for protesters dragged before Yanukovych's courts during the revolution. So we're in good position here. Ukraine was at the time in a state of turmoil. Russia had annexed the peninsula of Crimea and was aiding pro-Russian rebels in Ukraine's eastern provinces. Still are, right? Kyiv had lost control of Donetsk and Luhansk, two of the country's most important cities, and protesters' barricades still dominated the center of the capital. The country needed a new president, and that May elected a magnate named Petro Poroshenko. So they're still not in the clear, as it turns out, in hindsight, right? Although he had served as a minister under Yanukovych and was himself a billionaire, Poroshenko pledged to sell his confectionery business. I didn't realize that was his thing. Confectionery. It was Willy Wonka. What could go wrong? And to govern only in the interests of the people, to prosecute the corrupt former insiders, and to bring an end to the old way of doing things, including in the prosecutor's office. For too long, prosecutors had been acting essentially as gangsters in uniform rather than investigating crimes. Now, this does start to sound familiar, right? Considering how central prosecutors had been to Yanukovych's corrupt regime, There were significant doubts over both the honesty and the competence of Ukraine's lawmen, but Kagro was hopeful that his colleagues would see the importance of regaining the $23 million and thus do all they could to help the SFO. He told me that he translated the British request, sent it to his boss, and awaited results. Now, remind you, this is being written about in April of 2017, before the Trump campaign has gotten around to leveling their Burisma charges. So, we continue. The investigation began, but no matter how much we pushed the investigators, it was not effective, Kagro told me. Even when Zlochevsky's lawyers announced they would contest the freezing of the $23 million in a London court, the Ukrainian prosecutors still failed to send the SFO the evidence it needed to maintain the freezing order. First, the British wrote to me, then the Americans, with questions about what was happening with the investigation, Kagro remembered. It was hard. Now, so there's the first involvement of the Americans. The British wrote to Kagro and said, what's happening? Then the Americans wrote and said, what's happening? I thought we were prosecuting this thing. I thought we were going to try and get this stolen money back. Why aren't you helping us get the stolen money back? It was hardly the mutual trust and cooperation supposedly created by the London summit. U.S. and British diplomats were begging Ukraine to investigate a case, which, if it were successful, would benefit Ukraine, and yet nothing appeared to be happening. Again, time frame now is 2014 or so. The United States, President Barack Obama, Vice President, what's his name again? Yeah, Joe Biden. Right, that's the guy. Vice President is Joe Biden. The U.S. is begging Ukraine to investigate a case. What case are they begging them to investigate? The oligarch Zlochevsky, who owns Burisma. They are begging Ukraine to investigate Burisma and its ownership for corruption. And it's not happening. Why not? Eventually, 6 months after Gould first wrote to him, Kagro stepped decisively outside his area of responsibility and wrote to his boss in the prosecutor's office to demand action. I said I wanted this to be investigated properly, that the Brits be told about it, and that they get what they wanted, recalled Kagro. He said, if you want, get on with it. That's what his boss says to him. It was hardly the most enthusiastic of endorsements, but it was enough for Kagro. Now, I guess here, I don't know whether he's named at this, he's necessarily not named at this point, but I think at that point, who's the prosecutor general in Ukraine? We're going to look that up right now. Because, I mean, we know we're looking for, what's his name? Shokin, right? But it's not entirely clear. I guess I should go to Victor Shokin and see when was he prosecutor general. Here we go. He was in office February 10th, 2015 through March 29th, 2016. So he's not in yet. He's preceded at this point by Vitaly Yarema, who was in office. Oh, he's in office June 19th, 2014. So it might not even be him yet. He's preceded by, and these are all short timers here, Oleg, like Oleg, but Ole, O-L-E-H, Magnitsky. Magnitsky. Wow. I mean, that's obviously a variant of Magnitsky, which is ironic, to say the least. And when does he come in? February 2014 to June 2014. You see how short time these prosecutor generals really are. So he's in, and this is all according, of course, to Wikipedia, so we'll see how accurate that turns out to be. So I guess he's the one up until June handling this. And I think that, I don't know is there a date on the letter here? Just checking our timeline here. May of 2014 is when Gould gets the documents. And then the investigation began. Where's the timeline take us? Okay, he wants it to be investigated 6 months after Gould first wrote to him, which was when? Gould obtains the documents in May of 2014. Gould is in court in April of 2014. So right around, so April, May 2014 must have been when the letter was written, which means that we're talking about October or so of 2014, after the 6 months passes and Casco gets fed up. So it might have been, at that point, Magnitsky might have been out. It might have been Vitaly Yarema in, but only until early February, at which point it becomes Viktor Shokin. So by the time the Americans get involved, it's rotated again. Or by the time Biden gets involved and makes his trip to Ukraine and says you got to get rid of whoever the current prosecutor is, it has become Viktor Shokin. So just to establish that as part of the background, I'll continue on here. I said, let's see, we want this investigated properly. Then he writes to his boss, and the boss says, well, if you want to go ahead, then go ahead. Right? Hardly the most enthusiastic of endorsements, but it was enough for Casco. He forced investigators to work evenings and weekends. They put together a dossier, a dossier of evidence that Casco felt supported the SFO's argument that the defendant's assets were the product of criminal wrongdoing when he held public office, sent it to the SFO, and announced officially that Zlochevsky was suspected of a criminal offense in Ukraine. So now, the first time we finally have a Ukrainian government saying the guy who owns Burisma is suspected of a criminal offense here. It was only thanks to Casco that the SFO received any useful documents from Ukraine at all. I asked the Brits, what else do we need to do? Casco remembered, and they said, that's fine, that's more than enough to defend the freezing order in court. Well, their confidence was misplaced. In January of 2015, Mr. Justice Nicholas Blake, sitting in the Old Bailey, rejected the SFO's argument. The case remains a matter of conjecture and suspicion, he wrote in his judgment. To confiscate assets, prosecutors have to prove that the frozen money related to a specific crime, and, he ruled, the SFO had totally failed to do so. It was a humiliating reverse for British law enforcement, and for Gould, the lead investigator, who then moved to another agency. Gould told me in July of 2015 that he was personally disappointed, but declined to comment further. The judge unfroze the $23 million and handed it back to Zlochevsky. What has happened here? In 2014, the British government suspects that the owner of Burisma has hidden money in a French bank branch in London that was the ill-gotten proceeds of something, the sale of an oil depot, but looted money from the government of Ukraine, and they want to pry it loose and hand it back to Ukraine's new government to rebuild itself. Burisma has been involved in some corruption, they feel. The owner, certainly, of Burisma has been involved in some corruption, and we want to undo that corruption, says the British government. The American government joins in helping. They ask the Ukrainian government to please help them prosecute the case there in the UK, and the Ukrainian government basically, the Prosecutor General's office basically declines to help. No, we're not going to do it. Then they get put over a barrel. Okay, fine. And so they turn over some documents, but it's such a weak, I guess they've done a poor job of it. Although the prosecutors at the SFO think it's a good one, they go to court. What ends up happening, the British judge says it's just not enough. We're giving the money back to the Burisma guy, Zlochevsky. Now, how did that happen? Why did the judge decide that? We'll continue on here. The British government had made a big announcement of the original decision to seize the funds, but did not publicize the reversal. It's not hard to understand why. It was, after all, an embarrassing setback for the UK and the US, which had held up this particular case as a sign of its commitment to confiscate money belonging to Yanukovych's allies and return it to the people of Ukraine. When I contacted the SFO in May of 2015, a spokeswoman told me, We are disappointed we were not provided with the evidence by authorities in the Ukraine necessary to keep this restraint order in place, but declined to comment further because she said the investigation was ongoing. In January of this year, I contacted Dominic Grieve, who had made the dramatic announcement of the asset freezing. He's still an MP, but no longer in the government. He told me he had no recollection of the case. That's pretty interesting by itself. Zlochevsky's lawyers at Peters & Peters told me that the judge had ruled unequivocally that there was not reasonable grounds to allege that our client had benefited from any criminal conduct. Burisma's lawyers have since repeatedly referred to the ruling as evidence of their client's vindication, also sounds familiar, which calls into question the decision of the UK government to use this particular case as an example of its determination to recover assets and return them to Ukraine when it had been unable to prove that there were sufficient grounds to keep the $23 million frozen. When Casco read the judge's ruling, he had questions, but of a rather different nature. At the hearing, the tycoon's lawyers had not just attacked the case against their client, but also produced evidence of his innocence. Evidence that came from the unlikeliest of sources. Justice Blake's 21-page judgment made reference half a dozen times to a letter dated December 2nd, 2014, signed by someone in the Ukrainian prosecutor's office, which stated baldly that Zlochevsky was not suspected of any crime. Casco felt this was bizarre. Everyone in a senior position at the prosecutor's office must have known he was leading a frenzied investigation into Zlochevsky at that precise time, so how could anyone have signed off on a letter saying that no investigation was going on? The letter appeared to be crucial to the judge's ruling, which stated that Zlochevsky, quote, was never named as a suspect for embezzlement or indeed any other offense, let alone one related to the exercise of improper influence in the grant of exploration and production licenses. As Casco saw it, his colleagues had failed to help him when he begged them to investigate Zlochevsky, but when it came to writing a letter to help the tycoon, he believed they had happily done so. According to Casco, there were really only three possible reasons for why a senior Ukrainian prosecutor would have written a letter for Zlochevsky rather than assisting Casco. He was either incompetent, corrupt, or both. Peters & Peters did not respond to specific questions about the letter. The allegations implied by your questions are untrue and entirely without foundation, is all they said. Whatever the explanation for this mysterious letter, the case highlighted a crucial flaw in countries' efforts to cooperate across borders. Even in the rare case when the UK does freeze a foreign official's property, it is dependent for evidence from colleagues abroad who usually have fewer resources, less training, and a decades-long tradition of institutionalized corruption, at least when it comes to Ukraine. That means that any misconduct or incompetence by the Ukrainian prosecutors can undermine a case in the UK as surely as if the same actions were committed by the SFO. We'll probably have to leave it at this point here today. There's still plenty more. Maybe we can revisit it on Friday, but I think you're getting the idea here. What was apparently actually happening, at least when we were writing about this outside of the context of Joe Biden, that is outside of the United States and before the kickoff of his campaign and the targeting of his campaign by the Trump campaign, the picture we're starting to get here is that the United States and the UK were desperately trying to get the Ukrainian prosecutor general to prosecute the owner of Burisma and help and in fact move the case to the UK. Don't leave it in your hands. We'll prosecute him here. Just give us the evidence and we'll take care of it if corruption is too much of a problem for you guys. Not only were they slow in producing the evidence, and not only did they not apparently produce enough evidence, but someone somewhere who wasn't the head of the prosecutor general's office yet, but maybe later became head of the prosecutor general's office, sent unauthorized a letter praising Zlochevsky and insisting to the British court that he was not suspected of any sort of crime whatsoever. if it turns out that that's Viktor Shokin or someone very closely related to him who was behind the letter, well, that explains an awful lot, doesn't it? It explains why the U.S., in addition to the UK, might in fact be extraordinarily interested on behalf of all the Western democracies in getting rid of the prosecutor general who may have had a hand in letting Zlochevsky and Burisma off the hook the one time a Western court thought they had him dead to rights. And the whole thing, the whole accusation, I think you already knew this, that Joe Biden intervened, A, on behalf of Hunter Biden, which is weird, and B, in a way that protected Burisma, is totally upside down. Nothing new, of course, when you're dealing with Republicans, that they would take something and turn it upside down and inside out. Although, it does let you, give you room to question why, for instance, Joe Biden might not have been more insistent with Hunter Biden about joining the board of Burisma after all of this. But I guess if you tried to convince your dad that it was all about cleaning up the corruption there, he might even have believed you.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Much more in store for you, of course, as Justice Putnam takes over the microphone for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next. Let's skip down to paragraph 2 here and get to some of the meat of what he's got. Governors of both parties warn that the Trump Medicaid cuts are putting people in danger. You know a lot about it, but we haven't talked a lot about it. That and much, much more on the much wider-ranging show next.